if you want to turn to Psalm 78. Psalm 78. There we go. And we're in, so we're doing this in 4 parts with how long this psalm is, but today we're looking at verse 17 through 37 of Psalm 78. And if you remember, this is Asaph looking back at his own people, the nation of Israel, and seeing how they, even after receiving the great miracle of the Red Sea and seeing the cloud lead the congregation during the day and the pillar of fire at night and all these amazing physical miracles they saw, they still rebelled. They still did not trust God. They still refused to truly lay back in his arms and allow God to be their God and protector. And so we continue on with that theme today. And the title I'm titling this section is God's Provision in the Midst of Man's Sin. God's provision in the midst of man's sin. And so starting in verse 17, we'll read to verse 31 to begin. Psalm 78, starting verse 17, it says, "And they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. And they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. Yea, they spake against God. They said, Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Behold, he smote the rock, that the waters gushed out, and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Can he provide flesh for his people? Therefore the Lord heard this and was wroth. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and an anger also came up against Israel, because they believed not in God and trusted not in his salvation. Though he had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven, and had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them of the corn of heaven. Man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full. He caused an east wind to blow in the heaven, and by his power he brought in the south wind. He rained flesh also upon them as dust, and feathered fowl like the sand of the sea. And he let it fall in the midst of their camp, round about their habitations. So they did eat and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust. But while their meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them, and slew the fattest of them, and smote down the chosen men of Israel." So crying for meat. Now in Exodus chapter 16, there's a few incidences here where we see this provision. These are, well-documented experiences. If you want to turn there, Exodus 16, we'll look at 16 and a little bit in 17. This is the first time these things happened, where God met real needs. In Exodus 16, verses 2 through 4, it says, "And the whole congregation of the children of Israel." Now, I should say, this is right after the Red Sea. Miriam, Moses' sister, had just made up that song, singing about the Egyptians are tossed into the sea, their chariots are destroyed. They had just got done with that. And now here in verse 2, "The whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said unto them, Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For ye have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or no." So right there is an example of they murmured. They did a wrong thing. They attacked God's chosen leaders, Moses and Aaron, and yet God says, you know what? And he has issues with it. He doesn't like it, but he does provide for them. Later on in verse 11 of that same chapter, verses 11 through 13, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel. Speak unto them, saying, At eve ye shall eat flesh, and in the morning ye shall be filled with bread, and ye shall know that I am the Lord your God. And it came to pass that at eve the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host." So you see, God provided the quail. He provided the manna from heaven. In Psalm 78 here, it calls it angel food. It's a beautiful thing. We don't know really what it was, but it was something God used to provide for his people physically, and then he gave them meat during the evening. And then later on in chapter 17, starting in verse 1, it says, "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses, and said, Give us water, that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do ye tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses, and said, Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? Unto these people? They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the Lord, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river, take in thy hand, and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the children because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? So we see three examples there of they murmured for bread, God gave them bread. He murmured for meat, God gave them the quails. They murmured and said, We're thirsty, or they chided with Moses, they attacked God's the leader. He gave them water. So even though, again, and we'll see here another example in a little bit, they're whining, complaining, and yet God still provides for their needs. Such an amazing, faithful God. And I've said that, I'm so thankful for that even today, that when I'm unfaithful, God is still faithful. He's always there. Again, I don't reap the whole benefits when I'm disobedient. I cannot reap the complete and total reward that God desires from me every day when I resist sin, when I love my enemy, when I do not repay evil for evil. If I resist that and I don't do it, God's still faithful. He doesn't break his promises. I don't get the full reward. I do receive, in a sense, a punishment. But in this case here, and the same in our own lives, God is so faithful. Even though, I mean, I can't even believe how much complaining we must sound, how much complaining we do to God on a daily basis, and yet we still, God bless us, why aren't you helping us? And I mean, as a human being, we would have been tired with each other a long time ago. I know for me, patience runs pretty thin, and yet God is so faithful. So, three examples there. Moving on, this particular verses 17 through 31, is actually speaking of an exact specific event in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, and we'll go into that in a little bit. But we'll start here, starting in verse 18, and they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. And the fact that they use the word lust there speaks to, it wasn't just that a necessity. There was some gluttony here involved. There was lust, not just simply sensual, but more of a, man, I could sure use some meat. You know, this bread's okay. It's filling me. God's providing for it. It's meeting my need. The water's good. Thank you, God. We're going to leave it at that. We're going to be content. No, they wanted something more. And so this desire for the meat in this particular incident seems to be coming from a very selfish place. Verse 19, yea, they spoke against God. They said, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? In verse 20, he smote the rock. Water gushed out. The streams overflowed. We've seen David do this, and we've talked about this in other passages as well, where it's very encouraging many times when you're going through a time of confusion, a time of suffering, to look back and say, hey, God did that for me yesterday. He did it for my family a month ago. He's always provided for us. Even a year ago, remember this particular incident? You can write it down or look in God's word and see examples. In this case here, Israel is doing just that. They say, yeah, he provided for us. He provided water back there, but can he provide anything else? Almost questioning God. And it's a really sad place mentally and in your heart to be when you're trying to deal with times of suffering, because they are remembering what God did, but they're going, well, that's probably all he can do. Yeah, he saved us once, but that's probably all he's got left. He provided this way, but he can't do this again, or he did this little bit, I bet he can't do this much, And even to say, can God even meet our need? Can he even provide a meal for us in this God-forsaken place? It was almost like what they're saying. Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? So they're questioning God's faithfulness. They ultimately do not have a trust and a belief in their God. Verse 21, therefore the Lord heard this, and he was angry. His fire was kindled against Jacob and against Israel. And the reason why, because they believed not in God. Verse 22, they trusted not in his salvation. Every single day, his plan was to show them through, again, the pillars, the fire and the clouds, the tabernacle right there in the center, the manna in the morning, the water at times when that was needed, taking care of that bitter brook. I think it was one of the first incidences where they were thirsty and God made a stream that was very bitter, was sweet again. Every single day there was probably real life examples where this huge congregation would say, wow, look, God provided this need and he provided this, and the word would pass through. And yet in the middle of a suffering, we forget all that, don't we? We seem to forget about what God did. We don't, whether it is we're keeping our Bibles closed, or the pain is just, or whatever it is, we're just so focused on us. And that's natural. It's natural for us as humans to do that. But it's so sad. Those are the times when we so need to remember, and yet we choose not to. We look at the current situation, and we think God's not fair, or whatever, we make excuses. And that's what Israel's doing here. And so God was angry. But verse 23, he comes through. He provides, he opens up the clouds, he provides the rain to come, he provides the manna to come down, he provides the meat to come, angel food. The east wind came in, and the feathered fowl there in 27, like the sand of the sea, covered their habitation. And in verse 29, we see that judgment's going to come. So they did eat and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. And that ties back to their lust. They had that selfish desire. It wasn't, he met their need. It wasn't that. Even though in the past, and in the passages we read there in Exodus, there was a real need there. They said, we're hungry, we need meat, we need something more to keep us up as we, continue on through this marching through the wilderness. But here there was lust involved. And so their own desires, God filled them up. He met their own selfish desires. And that's something else to speak to too. People, even Christians today, say, well, it's got to be God's will that we got this, or we did this, or we went this way because God let it happen. Well, God letting something happen doesn't necessarily mean that was that was an act of obedience on your part. God, even as a parent, God sometimes lets your children go, doesn't he? He'll say, okay, you really want that? I'll take off the hindrances. I'll remove the fences, and I'll let you go that direction. And we fall flat on our faces, or we experience some additional sufferings because we went that way. Some unforeseen consequences we experience. And so when God always fills our desires, that doesn't always mean, and I just say that from personal experience, that doesn't always mean that he's blessing it all the way through. Yes, it's exactly what you want to do. It is part of his will, but part of his will can also mean you need to get punished. You need a little bit of discipline. You need to start realizing why I've given you the rules I've given you, why I desire for you to go down this path. I can think of that with so many job experiences for myself, seeking God's will and going, this is totally not right, but God got me the job anyway. And I was able to see it in a very real way. This was not God's plan. This was not what I needed to be doing. So again, it's lust, it's their own desires. Verse 30, they were not estranged from their own lust. So they're not thanking God for this. They're right in the middle of it. They're getting fat. They're filling themselves up with this meat. But while their meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them. And so I'll read here from the book of Numbers, chapter 11. This is the exact story that Asaph is talking about here. Numbers 11, so there'll be a lot of similarities. Numbers 11. We'll just read a few verses here, but starting in verse 18. Numbers 11. Says, Numbers 11, starting in verse 18, and say thou unto the people, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, and ye shall eat flesh, for ye have wept in the ears of the Lord. That's an amazing, you have wept in the ears of the Lord. Not a good thing to do, okay? For you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and you shall eat. And you shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month until it come out of your nostrils. You are going to be sick of this. I'm going to make you keep eating. I mean, wow, he's really upset. God is, judgment is coming down, and this is straight to Moses. And so whether Moses repeated this or not, he's saying, you want meat? I'm getting so tired of your complaining. But he's still so gracious and merciful. And it be loathsome unto you, because that ye have despised the Lord which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why came we forth out of Egypt? Verse 21. And Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen, and thou hast said, I will give them flesh, that they may eat a whole month. Shall the flock and the herds be slain for them to suffice them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to suffice them? And the Lord said unto Moses, is the Lord's hand waxed short? Thou shalt see now whether my words shall come to pass unto thee or not. And so that particular conversation is Moses saying, well, wait a minute, God, when it comes to these footmen, whether these were ready soldiers or ready warriors, at the very least, it's not the whole congregation, but there's 600,000 footmen. And I think this would speak to men that could probably carry a sword and be somewhat useful in some kind of battle form. You have 600,000 just of them. Think of women and children. Think of elderly. You're talking at least 1 million. Okay, 1 million people, and you're going to give them enough food for a whole month, God? Are you going to drain the Mediterranean Sea of fish? Are you going to have to provide kill every living animal to provide this much? And God goes, Moses, is my hand all of a sudden pulled back where I can't do anything? I'm going to meet this need. And so the fact that God provides all this quail is really a miracle in and of itself. Moving on to verse 31, and so the Lord sent forth a wind from and there went forth a wind from the Lord and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as it were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. That's a lot of birds. Yeah, that's deep. That's deep. And the people stood up all that day, and all that night, and all the next day, and they gathered the quails he had gathered and he that gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them all abroad for themselves round about the camp. And while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled against the people. And the Lord smote the people with a very great plague. And he called the name of that place Kidroth Havahan, because there were buried the people that lusted. And the people journeyed from Kidroth Hazahan unto Hazeroth, and abode at Hazeroth. So a lot of birds, and there was some very, very greedy people, some very lustful people, some very selfish, gluttonous people just pigging out. Oh man, we got all this food. This is great. This is awesome. And God sends a plague. He punishes those who were lusting. He punishes the most extreme. And this kind of hit me. It was like, wow, I like to stuff my face now and then. What is that? Again, I'm not an Israelite. This is a different scenario. But there's some moderation we would see here. But this is coming from, again, a very selfish attitude from these Israelites. They've already displeased God with their lack of trust. They've already resisted God, and there's we don't believe you. We don't believe that. And they keep repeating this. Why did we leave Egypt? Why you were slaves there. Come on, you're on your way to be free people. You're going to the land that God has promised Abraham generations earlier, and you keep saying, why did we leave there? I mean, and so that's one incident that I'm sure just pricked the heart of God, just really frustrated them. The lack of trust, lack of belief, and now they're complaining from an attitude of, I just meet my fleshly needs, God. Meet my fleshly needs. They're not asking for just enough to stay alive. They're not asking for, we just want to be content with what we have. God had done so much for them already, and now they had this very gluttonous desire. And God desires to punish them. He ends up, he gives them their desire. And I would probably say that plague, it was probably definitely something that came from God, but just eating too much can do that too. I mean, you're whatever exactly occurred, it seemed to be an attack against the ones that had the deepest lust to fulfill those fleshly needs of I want to eat a lot. So that ends verse 31. The second half here of the verse, the next, not verse, but second section we'll look at here, verses 32 to 37, gives a cycle of man's attitude toward God. And so it's kind of a pullback from this story we just saw. And Asaph here desires to show these are the stages that led up to that. And this is the cycle that unfortunately keeps happening. And Israel keeps doing this over and over again. We fall into this cycle as well. Starting in verse 32, and it says, for all this, they sin still and believe not for his wondrous works. Therefore their days did he consume in vanity, and their years in trouble. So we start this cycle. So even after all that, even after they buried people in the ground, they're named it after a very sad incident of a lot of people died because we were so lustful for our physical needs to be met, and God met them, and he punished us for it. Okay, after that happened, they still sinned and believed not did not believe that God, these amazing works that God did was for their behalf. Verse 33, therefore their days did he consume in vanity, their years in trouble. I think that speaks to that generation that experienced all this, the main generation at that time. They were the generation that never got to see the promised land. That was Moses. That was the same age ranges like Joshua and Caleb. They ended up living through that time, but that generation was the one that died off during those 40 years. The purpose for that 40-year wandering was to punish them, to say, okay, you have spent all this time up to the border of Canaan. You have spent this whole time whining, complaining. A lot have been called out through punishments and plagues like this, and the ultimate disrespect to God and the act of unbelief was, we're not going to go into this land, even though you promised to us, God. The odds are too much against us. There's big giants. There's tall cities. Nuh-uh, not doing it. God cannot. He can't get us through this one. He parted the Red Sea. He destroyed the most powerful army in the world at that time. But we don't think he can help us in this situation. And so I think that's what 33 is talking about. He consumed their days. Their lives ended in vanity, unfortunately. I mean, it's so sad. They saw so much, and they could have had that experience in their lives of claiming victory of that land, and they died there in the wilderness, got buried in the sand. They refused to obey. They refused to believe. Their years ended in trouble. Verse 34, when he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and inquired early after God. And so mankind has this attitude of, we sin, God punishes us, okay? In this scenario here, with all these folks dying from this gluttonous plague that they experienced, there probably were some going, oh wow, God's real. Yeah, my goodness, my dad just died. I should probably follow after God. And so here it says they turned to God, they sought him, and they inquired of him early. I labeled this in my cycle of human behavior as a kind of a come to Jesus moment. A lot of people do that in times of hardship, in times of suffering, whether it's sitting in a jail cell, whether it's sitting in a hospital room, whether it's experiencing a really horrific, traumatic experience. Like, oh man, this is terrible. We should probably believe in Jesus, or something. We should probably go to church or call somebody, and it's a very kind of knee-jerk reaction of, I'm in this trouble and I've heard that God can help us through this. Let's just reach out to him and hopefully something will get better. So they've done this here in verse 34. Verse 35, and they remembered that God was their rock and the high God their Redeemer. So it seems here in verse 35, even though it was maybe perceived initially as very premature and almost, I have immediate needs, I want God to fix them. Here in verse 35, there seems to be some that are legitimately, sincerely believing God and sincerely worshiping him. They recognize that God is their rock. They recognize that God is their Redeemer. Those are all correct things and good things and things that really ground you in your faith. But nevertheless, verse 36, they did flatter him. Speaking about God, nevertheless, they did flatter him with their mouth, and they lied unto him with their tongues. We can't flatter God. We can't deceive him. We can't lie to him. I mean, how foolish is that? But I labeled this as after sincere worship, which I think many of them probably did have, there's a deception that falls over us. They're not lying to God, they're lying to themselves. Okay? God, we can't flatter God. We can't, oh God, you're so great. We can do that. If our heart's not in the right place, then that's wrong. We can't lie to him. We can't deceive him. But again, we can trick ourselves. And I think, it can, if you're not grounded in God's word, and I think studying it every day and really working out that faith on a daily basis, you can start that from a very sincere place and a very real and honest place. But as the years go by, we start seeing a system roll into place where we go, you know what, I'll go to church at this time, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this. I'll even be involved in many things during the week, and it eventually just becomes boxes you check off. The heart, the drive, the passion to do it for God's glory, to seek those opportunities to share the gospel, all those things, those things keep us on our toes. They really do. If we're really sincere about it, it really keeps us on fire. It's as humans, we so want to get into a routine and be able to just sit back and say, it's under control, I've got everything covered, we're just going to sit back and relax. But we are in a spiritual fight. We're in a battle, and we're in a war. And so this attitude here of going, nevertheless, I'll do my time over here. I'll make sure God is pleased with me over here. I'll check off this box over here. I'll do the right thing over here. On the outward appearance, I seem like everything's put together, and that can get into the deception category. We're really deceiving ourselves. Deception or complacency, I also called it. And then it leads to verse 37, the ultimate. For their heart was not right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. And ultimately there you're reaching full circle. I call this apathetic. This is where, as God's people and as Christians today, we can fall into this where if you're going through the motions, and I think of people that have served God and have done so much for a particular ministry or whatever, and we don't know their hearts, but I fear sometimes people have put in so much time and so much effort, but it was all done just going through the motions. It was not done with a real heart change of maybe they're truly saved, but they've done so much work, and it's just like, I'm just going to knock this out because it makes me look good, or it's for my own selfish purposes, or I have to please God because I got to pay him back, or some kind of skewed way of thinking about their relationship with God. Either whatever way it might have been, they're going to lose that reward. They're going to lose that opportunity to truly be blessed by that kind of work. And they'll eventually get to a place where the Israelites did there in verse 37, their heart was not right. They became apathetic. They became apathetic to the real things that truly can change a man's life and can shape a nation. And they weren't steadfast in his covenants. And that leads them to a perfect place again to sin, which they already have done through flattery and deceiving God, lying to him, and for their heart not to be right. That means they've spent a long time deceiving themselves. And they're right back where they started, and we go back to 32 and read it again. It's like they're going to sin again. They're going to, because they're not following God's covenants, Baal comes along, or Raka, or another god. Hey, let's worship him. He looks cool. He's got a nice temple. He's got nice promises there. Whatever the case is, anything flesh that's going to come along, hey, let's go after that. That feels good. And you forget God's covenants, become apathetic to those, and you're right back where you started. And so, unfortunately, that's where Israel is just continuing this cycle over and over and over again. And that's we'll see starting in verse 38. I guess it'll be next year. We'll look into that in verse 38. But we'll dive into that and see the continued process here of God dealing with his rebellious people and yet still being so faithful. So, any questions about that? Any thoughts on those verses?
Go back to Romans